Mummial attraction is easy to misunderstand because the word attraction feels familiar. A modern reader may hear it and think of energy, intention, vibration, or some invisible force between people. But the old idea is much more physical than that. It begins with a simple but disturbing question. What if something separated from the body was not treated as completely separate? Blood on a weapon, a trace left by a wound, a material remainder, a part that once belonged to a living body. That is where mummial attraction begins, not with a feeling, not with a mood, not with vague spiritual energy, with a trace. The simplest way to understand it is this. Mummial attraction is the idea that a bodily trace can remain linked to the body it came from. That one sentence unlocks the whole notion. Because in older magnetic magic, contact was not always treated as something that ended when two things separated. Contact could leave a hidden relation behind. A wound marks the body. Blood leaves the body. An object receives the blood. And the trace is imagined to still point back to its origin. That is the strange center of the idea. To us, separation feels obvious. Once something leaves the body, it becomes outside. Once the wound is no longer touching the weapon is just an object again. Once contact ends, the relation is over. But mummial attraction thinks in another direction. It asks what remains after contact. And the answer is not only matter, the answer is relation. That is why blood becomes so important here. Blood is not just a dramatic detail. It is the sign that the living body has left something behind. A blade marked by blood is no longer only metal in this way of thinking. It has touched life. It has received a bodily trace. And that trace is imagined as more than evidence. It becomes a link. This is where many modern explanations become too soft. They replace blood with energy. They replace contact with vibration. They replace bodily trace with memory. Those words may feel easier, but they blur the idea. Mummial attraction is more concrete than that. It is not saying everything is connected in a general spiritual sense. It is saying something much narrower and stranger. What comes from the body may still belong to the body in a hidden way. That is why the notion can feel uncomfortable. It does not let the boundary between person and object stay clean. A trace is not the whole person. A trace is not the living body. But it is not treated as nothing either. It becomes a remainder that still carries relation. Pause here, because this is the key difference. A normal trace tells us something happened. A footprint says someone passed. A scent says someone was there. Blood says the body was opened. A mark says contact occurred. But mummial attraction gives the trace a stronger role. The trace does not only point backward to the past, it is imagined to remain tied to the body that produced it. So the trace is not just a sign, it becomes a thread. Not a visible thread, not a physical chain. A hidden sympathy between the origin and the remainder. Now the whole structure becomes simple. First, there is a body. Then, there is contact. Then, contact leaves a trace. Then, the trace is imagined to remain linked to the body. That hidden link is the attraction. This is why the idea belongs to the old language of magnetic magic. Magnetism here is not only a piece of modern physics. It is a way of imagining hidden pull, hidden relation, hidden sympathy between things that seem separate. And mummial attraction is one of its most physical forms. It does not start in the sky. It does not start in the mind. It starts where body and matter meet. A wound, a trace, a remainder, a bond imagined beneath separation. That is also why this idea should not be turned into a ritual instruction. Its value is not that it gives something to imitate. Its value is that it reveals a way of thinking. Older occult ideas often become confusing because we translate them too quickly into modern words. When everything becomes energy, the specific meaning disappears. Here, the specific meaning matters. The body is not treated as closed. A trace is not treated as dead. separation is not treated as complete. That is the whole mechanism. And once you see it, mummial attraction stops being a vague occult phrase. It becomes a precise idea. A bodily trace can remain linked to its origin through hidden sympathy. That does not mean the claim has to be accepted, but it can be understood. And understanding is already a major shift. Because without that clarity, the idea becomes either horror, superstition, or vague mysticism. With clarity, it becomes an entry point into the old grammar of natural magic: contact, trace, sympathy, relation. A body leaves a mark. The mark remains. The remaining trace is imagined to still point back. That is mummial attraction. A trace, a body, a hidden bond. Once that is clear, the fog drops. The term stops being a vague occult phrase and becomes a precise entry in the old language of magnetic magic.